Welcome to the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat Program with Rabbi Shalom Rosner. Tzurba is a revolutionary halacha sefer which guides you through over 300 topics in Jewish law in a unique signature style. In this weekly series specifically, Rabbi Shalom Rosner learns through the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat volumes, helping us all master the Halachot of Shabbat in just 2 years. Tzurba volumes are available for purchase worldwide on Amazon. And to learn more about Tzurba, or for those in Eretz Yisrael looking to purchase volumes, please head over to tzurbaolami.com. For more information, see the description below. And now, Rabbi Shalom Rosner.
Okay, we are up to the Melacha of Tochein. The Melacha of Tochein, grinding. That's the next one of the Melachas in our discussion of Dash, Borer, and Tochen, the Sidur, the Pas, the first 11 Melachas in Hilchot Shabbos, Melacha Shabbos. And again, we are in volume number 19 of the Lax Family Edition volumes of the Tzurba Rabbanan, the Aaron Family volume, and we discussed Borer for 2 Shiurim, and now we're discussing Tochain, grinding, one of the most Lamaisa Malachas. Again, every Malacha is Lamaisa. Probably 34 of the Malachas could come up in one's house, maybe 33, and some of them are more Lamaisa than others. Tochen is one of those Malachas that could come up all the time. So how do you define grinding? Tochen is translated as grinding, but how do you define that in terms of Melacha Shabbos? Says the Menuchas Ava, we're on page 73, Menuchas Ava, Melechas Tochini Achas Milametes Avas Malachas. Asuras Minator B'Shabbos. Tochen is one of the 39 malachas that are asur. Mahus Melechas Tochen hu. What is the essence of Tochen? He chalukas guf echad legufim dakim harbe. It is the splitting up of one unit, one item, into many different parts. So again, the classic Tochen is where I take wheat and I crush it into flour. That's the Av Melacha of Tochen. Or I crush herbs in order to make crushed powder to use for dyeing purposes. So any of that's the Melacha of Tochen, taking one item and grinding it into many. Grinding in a mill. Grinding spices. And what about chopping? If somebody chops and cuts very, very small, tiny, with a knife, yerek talush, a vegetable, a detached vegetable. If it's an attached vegetable, that's the Melacha of kotzer. That's harvesting and cutting. But if it's already detached, eitzim talushim, or cutting wood very finely to make sawdust, as we will talk about these details. So that is also taking one item, one unit, and cutting it into many different units, tiny little pieces. So that's the Melacha of Tochein. So how does one define tiny little pieces? Like, you're allowed to cut a challah in half. You're allowed to cut pieces of a challah. You're allowed to cut a vegetable into a cucumber, into a couple of slices. So what's small? What's the Melacha of Tochein? That is the tricky question. That is the question to ask about the Gemara. So first of all, grinding, pulverizing into tiny little pieces is included. What about cutting? What about cutting an item? As we just saw, the Menuchas Ava gave examples. But let's see exactly, does everyone agree to that? Let's say cutting vegetables. Making an Israeli salad on Shabbos. Is that okay? Do you have to do anything different than normal? So part of it is how to understand the Gemara in Shabbos, Ayin Dalad. Ayin Dalad Amabez, that's the Gemara right after the Mishnah of the Avos Malachas, Daf Ayin Gimel. Says the Gemara, Va'tochen, Amar Papa, source number 2. Hai Mam de Parim Silka. Somebody who, Parim Silka, they usually would translate as Parim slicing, cutting beets. Chayev Mishum Tochen. Somebody who cuts beets. So it seems to be a Beferish Gemara. Cutting vegetables, maybe in very tiny pieces. Chayev Mishum Tochen. Amar Menashe. Haiman de Sala Silsi. Somebody who chops wood. Chayev Mishum Tochen. So again, according to Rashi, like the way that we just explained, according to Rashi, this means cutting, right? Parim and salis is an act of cutting. Says Rashi, Parim silka machatcho hadek. You cut it finely. Desala silsi eitzim dakim l'haveresh. I'm cutting up wood very finely in order to make a fire. So that is a tolda of Tochein. Slicing very finely into tiny pieces of vegetable is a tolda of Tochein. The Rambam also translates this as mechatech. Mechatech is to cut. Ha-mechatech is a yarek dak dak de lavashlo. Harez told us Tochein v'chayev. If you cut it, the Rambam adds in lavashlo. We'll have to get back to that. But he says if you cut it, that's Tochain. So Rashi and the Rambam all say that cutting could be included in the Melacha of Tochen. The Rambam also in Hilchot Shabbos in source number 5. Perek Ches Halacha Tezvav. Hamachatich Yarak Talush. If somebody cuts a detached vegetable, how is it told us Tochen? That's Tochen, exactly what the Gemara said. V'chein hanoser eitzim lehanos minasaris shalahen. Or somebody chops wood to get the sawdust. Avamachatich eitzim eno chayv shidakti behen k'tei lavasha be'akala. Just chopping wood, bigger pieces is not. But that's Rashi, that's the Rambam. If you look at Rabbeinu Hananel, early Rishon, already on the border of the Gaonim, he says that's not what the Gemara means. When parim silka, sala silse, no. Cutting is not the Melacha of Tochen. Tochen's pulverizing. Tochen is crushing. Says Rabbeinu Hananel, Haimarim de parim silka, pirish ke'ein ketisha, velo ke'ein chituch. If somebody pounds it, if somebody crushes it, that's Tochen, not cutting. Cutting is not Tochen, according to the Rabbeinu Hananel. Chayiv mishum Tochen. V'chein on the solas silsi. What do you see in that word solas silsi? Soles. Soles is flour. That's what it's related to, says the Rabbeinu Hananel. So, major machlokas Rishonim, whether the Melacha of Tochen can include cutting. And the question is, how do you understand that Gemara? If you look in the Rosh summarizes, and he says, I think the Rabbeinu Hananel's right. I think he's right, says the Rosh. There in source number 7 on this Gemara, Pirish Rabbeinu Hananel Zal Atzei Dekalim She'omdim Shivi Ke'enimin Kishimefarik Hanimin. When you cut them and you crush them, it ends up being dak, like sawdust, we would call it. Lefichach Hamanafso Chayim Mishum Tochen Upirish Hagunu. I think this is a correct pshat. Dumya Dasala Silsi. Umasha Pirish Rashi. That's what the Rashi says, and I'll lay out what the Rambam says. The Parim Silka Kishimachatich Yirakos dak. Pirish tamuahu. That is a wonder. It's a pirish tamua. Davershu ochel umachatich ozo dak ein zayich botchina. Cutting is not tochein, says Rabbeinu Hananel. So we have a machlokas Rishonim, and the Shulchan Aruch is machmir. The Shulchan Aruch passes like the Rambam and like Rashi. Hamachatich hayarak dak chayev mishum tochein. If you cut a vegetable dak small, chayev mishum tochein. Wonders the beer halacha. So what does that mean? How do you define dak? Right? Other malachas are clear. You know separation and cleaning a little bit, then plowing and seeding and cutting. What does it mean to cut dak? Says the Bir Halacha in the next source, in source number 9, it's very unclear. It's very unclear. So you're basically only allowed to do what you know for sure is not dak. Whatever might be dak is not allowed. Says the Bir Halacha. He quotes the Gemara that we saw, and then he quotes Rashi, Paris Mecharcho Daktaf, Fenkos Tosfos, Avabachatichos Gedolus Ksas, but slightly bigger pieces, Ein Derachatchina Bakach. That's not Tochen, Fenkos of a Rambam Dak. Kol Zelenian Chiyuv, regarding an Isser Daraisa, it's got to be Dak. Avalenian Isser, Yeshli Zoher Ma'od Bazeh. Regarding Isser, one has to be very careful, says the Mishnah Berurah. Dikfar Kasa B'Sefer Yereim, Leblazomi Metz, the Shir Dakusalono Dolano. We don't know. We don't know how small. Okay, so we'll keep this in mind for as we continue. So number 1, that's the definition of Tochain. Next, what does Tochain apply to? There are a number of limitations that are mentioned by the Rishonim that are not in the Gemara. The Gemara has certain limitations by other malachas, Ein Disha Ele B'Gedulei Karka, and the like. But the Tochain does not have it, but the Rishonim have it. Here's number one. Tosfos. Question is, what does Tosfos mean? Tosfos says there, Shabbos Ayin Dalet, on that Gemara. Source number 10. We're on page 77. Says Tosfos, Haimam Deparim Silka, Dafka Besilka Shayach Tchina. Only by beets. Beets. That's pretty unusual. There's a separate Melacha by beets, says Tosfos, and obviously it applies to wheat and flour. That's the Av Melacha. Obviously it applies to spices, crushing them or herbs to make the dyes. That's what the Gemara, that's the cases that Chazal give. But now Tosfos is spreading it to fruits and vegetables. It says Tosfos only beets or maybe something like beets. Aval shar ochlin shari, but other foods are okay. What is Tosfos talking about? Tosfos says only beets. So what's the category that Tosfos is alluding to? So Tosfos, some Achronim say that beets cannot be eaten raw unless they are broken into fine pieces. Maybe that's what Tosfos means. Where Tochain achieves a change in the status of the food. Beforehand, it was inedible. Tochain made it edible. That's how some Achronim understand Tosfos. If you look in the Rambam is a little more expanded than that. The Rambam does not limit it to beets, right? The Rambam applies it to, we had the Rambam before. The Rambam applied it to other. He says, "Hamachadech hasei yerek," back in source number 4. Vegetables. So is there any limit on the Rambam? So the Rambam, though, says the Lashon, he says it twice. He says it back in source number 4. And he says it here again in source number 11, and we're up to now. Perek Zayin Halacha Hey, Hatolda, Hiya Melacha Adoma La'av, Me'elu Avos. Tolda is similar to the Av, as we know. Ketzad. Hamachatech was an example of a Tolda. Hamachatech has a Yerek Ma'at, Levashlo. If somebody cuts up very finely a vegetable to cook it, Harei Zachayev. Shezu Melacha Tolda Tchina. That's a Tolda of Tchina. Why does the Rambam add in that word Levashlo? Remember Tosfos, the Achronim understood Tosfos as saying only when the Tochain creates a new reality for the food, making it edible, that's where we have the Melacha. If look in the Kesef Mishnah, Rabbi Yosef Cairo says that the Rambam's mention of Levashlo, right, what does Tochain have to do with the Levasha? So what is Levashlo? To again tell me that Tochain applies only when a person is getting ready for cooking. Levashlo, right? Though it can apply to a vegetable which is often eaten raw, but is presently being cut specifically for cooking. Not like Tosfos. Tosfos says if it can be eaten raw, that doesn't apply. Even if it can be eaten raw, but if you're preparing it for the cooking, so then that is called a Melacha. There is no Tochain for finely cutting vegetable pieces that won't be eaten raw, only when the context is Levashlo. That's what the Kesef Mishnah says for the Rambam. Nirish Rabbeinu Mefarish the Dafka Noket Silka. That's why he says beets, because beets are cooked. Shechotchen oso dak labishol. Vehu adin l'shar yerakos. Shechotchen oso dak labishol. Only where you're cutting it for cooking. So another limit. Tosfos says only where beets, which Achronim say mean only where the Tochain allows it to be edible. The Rambam says only where your kavana is levashel, because that's a stage of the process, a stage of the cooking process that is taking place. The Aruch HaShulchan can't believe what the Kesef Mishnah says. Tochen and Bishol are two different malachas. What are you, Tochen's only going to be chayiv? But it's like mochik amanas lichtov? No, they're opposite malachas. Right? Korei amanas litfar. You understand why those two go together? Tochen amanas lavashlo. Those two are separate malachas. So says the Aruch HaShulchan. Says Yechiel Michal Epstein. I don't know what the Kesef Mishnah is talking about. That's not what the Rambam means. Amnam lani as daiti ma'od tamua. Says the Aruch HaShulchan. I wonder demai nafkamina b'melechas tchina im kedei lavashel o shelo lavashel. What difference does it make whether it's levashel or not? V'shema tomar b'bnei she'ikr tchina hu b'kemach v'hu kedei lefos. Most of the time, the ikr is when it's by flour, and that's getting ready for baking. But there are other examples. So he says, "V'lulei divrei Rabbeinu Beis Yosef," or not for the Beis Yosef, I would give a different shot for the Rambam. Hayisi Omer, Damash Omer Rambam kedei lavashlo, ein kavanaso dafka lavashlo. It's not only ela klomar shemachatcho dak ad kedei lavashlo. It's just giving a shiur of normal cooking preparations. When you have something that's normally cut up very small in order to cook it, that's where Tochen applies. If it's normally cut up small in order to cook it, so then that's normal. If it's not normally cut up small into small pieces, so then maybe that wouldn't be Tochen. Right? That's what the Rambam is not saying dafka when it comes to bishul. So you have the limitation of Tosfos, you have a limitation of the Rambam, and then you have many Rishonim who don't limit it at all. Many Rishonim who say that it doesn't only apply to beets, that's just an example, it applies to all fruits and vegetables. And that's what the Smag says, and that's what the Rashbam says. And there you have the Yereim, again one of the Bali Atosos, of Blessed be Metz, in source 14, Aser, Lefarer, Peiros, Bishum Tochen. Crushing up fruit is a Tochen. So again, who do we paskin like? The Shulchan Aruch paskin like the last day, the Yereim and the Smag, and the Rashbam, that Tochen applies to all fruits and vegetables. All fruits and vegetables. The Mishnah Berurah says, mashma tiafilu biyarkos sharolochan chayim. Even if you're able to eat it raw, still yesh tchina ba'ochlin. There is Tochen when it comes to food. The Yalkut Yosef here cites both opinions regarding eating vegetables for raw consumption. So l'chadchila yesh lahachmir, right? Because the Aruch HaShulchan does not think the Rambam is bedafka, and the other Rishonim for sure don't mention bishul. So this is in terms of cutting it into very small pieces, and we still don't know what small is. But what happens if one dices and leaves them very long? Right, one cuts something into very long pieces. So it's small in two directions. It's flat and it's thin, but it's long. So could that be Tochain? Could you have Tochain if you have very long pieces and only small in one or two of the directions? So Rav Elyashiv is medayik from a Rashi. Rashi, I think we discussed in the Borer sugis also. The Gemara in Shabbos Ayin Dalet says that Abaya says if somebody builds a basket, a barrel on Shabbos, you could be chayiv 11 chatos. You could be doing 11 avos melacha, or told us 11 melachas. Amar Abai Hamad David Chalsa chayiv 11 chatos. 11. So what are they? Source Rashi, source 18. So Rashi has a deya, and the other Rishonim also. Rashi goes a couple of melachas, including Tochen. Asan dakos me'achas shtayim o shalosh harei Tochen. If you take one piece of the barrel and you make it into two or three pieces, that's Tochain. Says Rashi. 1 second. Says Rabbi Yashiv. L'char, for a barrel, you're not using tiny little pieces, right? You're using long pieces, maybe, of the wood. And Rashi calls that Tochain. What do you see? That even slicing, even if one side, in one dimension, it remains long, that is good enough to be Tochain. And that's what the Aruch Shabbos paskins. The Aruch Shabbos is Rav in Yerushalayim, Rav Reuben, very popular halacha seforim. Mutar lachol yerak leprusos ve'en bazeh mishum Tochain. You could cut a vegetable into pieces. That's not Tochain. Ein lach toch yerak leritzuos dakos. But you shouldn't cut it into very thin pieces. Mishum teisur Tochain. V'lechein also lachto gezer o kruv v'chayotze bo leritzuos dakos kedugma salad gezer. So that's the Aruch Shabbos based on Rav Elyashiv. But if you look in Rav Moshe does not think so. Rav Moshe assumes dak means in all the directions, right? All the directions. There's a big difference between, what do you do with the Rashi? What do you do with the Rashi and cutting the reeds in order to make the barrel? So Rav Moshe would ask this in source number 20 now. We're on page 81. Hayim Mr. Tchina B'Yerakos, Hu Davka Keshechotek Dak Ba'orech U Berochav Ketchinas Kemach. Does it have to be small in all dimensions and directions? Ogam Keshechotek Ba'orech Levad O Berochav Levad. Even if you only do in one direction, that's also. Says Rav Moshe, Tkanim, reeds are different. Reeds are different in Rashi's Pshat. Lanias daiti pashut sharak lasos bekanim lasias chalsa havi Tochen basias mikana achas shayim o shalosh. Because there, it achieves a different status. And it's dafka there, but not by food. By food, it doesn't apply by dicing. And therefore, it says Rav Moshe, because if not, what would be the shiur? The locain says Rav Moshe, Hari leka gvula zeh. Tiye asur lachto kikar lechem lechatichos ktanos. Cutting bread into thin slices. Why isn't that a problem? Right? When it comes to food, it doesn't apply. In lo haya heter shein tochen achar tochen. We're not for the other heter, which we didn't mention yet. Ela pashut, food is only when it's in all directions. So major machlokas achronim, Rav Moshe, Rav Elyashiv. So you see on the bottom the picture, sliced vegetables, regular sliced vegetables, cutting up some cucumbers and celery to munch on, no problem. Thin carrot strips, right? Machlokas Rav Moshe and Rav Elyashiv. Israeli salad. So we'll have to see in the coming sources. So one heter, what did we just say? You might have a limitation. Okay, Tochen is a Melacha. So the whole structure of Tochen are limitations. Maybe it only applies to beets, meaning Tosfos says, maybe it only applies to where it was not edible before the Tochen. Maybe it only applies where you're doing it lavashlo, the Rambam. Next, maybe it only applies, now we're on page 82, where you're not doing it for immediate consumption. Whoa, this is a chiddush. Right, this is a rashba. This is not in the Gemara anywhere. The Gemara has the heter of miyad, as we discussed at length in Borer. Ochel miyad la'alter. By no other malachas, you can't plow for immediate consumption. Right, obviously, because plowing puts the seeds in. You can clean for immediate. I want to wear this shirt right now, so I'm going to clean it. No, there's no kibus l'tzarach miyad. But I want to trap l'tzarach miyad. There's Borer, and now the Rashba says Tochain. The Rashba says Tochain borrows from Borer. Mistavra, says the Rashba in Tshuva, source 21. Tahad de parasilka dafka b'machatech dak dak de lo'ochlo l'machar o afilu lo bayom. It's cutting it. It's usher only if it's for later. Ula achar sha'a lafisha darko shel silka l'chatcho dak dak be'er bishulo, because that's the normal way to do it. But right beforehand, cutting, dicing, crushing, aval la'ochlo miyad mutter. But if you're doing it to eat right now, it's mutter. Shalo asru al adam le'echol ma'acholo chatichos gedolos oktanos. The Torah doesn't demand that you eat big pieces and you swallow and you choke, chas v'shalom. The Torah says you're allowed to eat. So this is part of eating, says the Rashba. Right before you eat, you separate, and right before you take out what you don't want, and right before you eat, you cut into small pieces. Ki'inyan sha'amru and borer, just like borer. Just like borer, this is the heter of the Rashba. Ta'alma kol she'ochel alter kederach shedarka shebnei adam lechol. If you're eating, and you're eating it right, doing it right now, even though the act itself is a daraisa. If you would do it b'maniach la'achar zman, but if you're doing it for now, it is mutter. This is the Rashba. So the Beis Yosef says, if you want to slice or dice something, there are already a couple of limitations. He says at the end of his piece, l'chadchila, though you shouldn't rely on any of these. Right, look at that Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef is Shinuy Chaf Aleph, it's source 22. It says maybe Tochen is going to be mutter if you like this Rashba. Sheyochal alter l'divrei Rashba. Number 2, Tosfos. Tosfos says only if it cannot be eaten raw. Number 3, Rabbi Chananel. Rabbi Chananel said all cutting is mutter. Remember, we don't paskin that way, but all cutting. And the Rambam says if it's not levashel, it's going to be mutter. And if you cut it in any little bigger pieces, that's also mutter. Lamaisa, says the Beis Yosef, Hilkach Nira, the Kuliyam Ashari, Umikol Makom, Nachan Adavar, the end of source 22. Nachan Adavar la Hazir, Sheyachatchem lachatichos gedolos. Warn that people should cut it a little bigger pieces than normal, Vishayochlo la alter, and eat it right away, so you cover your bases, the Rashba, and cutting it a little more. Again, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't quote any of these heterim. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't quote Tosfos, doesn't quote the Rambam, doesn't say Lavashlo. And the Shulchan Aruch does not quote the heter of the Rashba. Miyad. But the Ramah does. The Ramah does. Source 23, the Shulchan Aruch. Shin Chaf Aleph Yud Beis. Hamachatech hayarak dak dak hayim mishum tochein. If you cut something very finely, very small, tochein. Again, what if it's long pieces? Machlokas or Moshe and Rav Yashiv. But then the Ramah says, V'kol zelo mayri ela b'chotechu meiniach. Where's the issue? If you cut it, then you leave it. Avalan la'achlo miyad hakol shari. But to eat right away, mutter. Says the Ramah, I hold like the Rashba. And he quotes that Rashba. Achronim, the Mishnah Berurah quotes Achronim that maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't rely on this Rashba that the Ramah quotes. The Maggid Avram. The Maggid Avram says, I beg to differ. Source 24. The Maggid Avram here says, Shin Chafal of Tezvav. Ubishol de Giboram mifak peik al eter zeh. V'gam Beis Yosef kazali zer lachto chadichos gedolos. Miyad is only said by Borer. It's not said by Tochen. Avo b'medina seinu, says the Magen Avram in Poland. Nogu lachto chatznon dak dak ma'od v'ishlam amashi yismochu. People relied on the Rashba. People relied on the Ramah. Okay, they have what to rely on. I don't think it's the Chadchila, says the Magen Avram. But people rely on it. V'al kol panim asur latzos yitzias beis hakneses to be in samach l'sudoso mamish. But you still need real miyad. You can't use flexibility. In this miyad, you need real miyad. So the Magen Avram is really against the heter, and he'll stretch and he'll defend Klal Yisrael by saying, okay, that's what they rely on. The Aruch HaShulchan wonders, says, no, the Rashba is right. The Aruch HaShulchan says the Ramah says it, the Ramah says it, and therefore there is not a problem. And whenever you need the miyad to work, even as we discussed in Borer, it's going to take you 2 hours to prepare for the meal, so you start 2 hours before, and that's already called miyad. V'gam re'isi, says the Aruch HaShulchan, Misha kasav dem chotchim ba'betzalim shtayim v'gam l'shos kodem asuda. If you cut it way before karov l'chi of chatas v'tamahani atu lekar abosina matirim legamrei. There are a number of heterim, and therefore the Mishnah Berurah, the Aruch HaShulchan says, I defend the Rashba and the Ramah, and the Mishnah Berurah says, Lamaisa, if you don't have to rely on it, don't rely on it, but yesh mi'amal lismoch if one does it. Umitam zeh kosvu kama achronim gamkein to nachon l'snai kamosh kasa Beis Yosef. Try to go like the Beis Yosef, or the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Kar was machmir, not like this heter. Umikol makom anogin lachtocha betzalam batzon dak dak. But if they do it, they have what to rely on. Maybe the Rabbi Chananel, there's no Tochen by slicing, cutting. Maybe there's no Tochen if you're not doing Gil Vashlo. Maybe Miyad is a heter. All of these are suggestions. That's what the Shmir Shabbos also quotes the same idea. Gidule karka chayim. You have fruits or vegetables that are not cooked. What does that mean? If they're falling apart, that's a heter that's not in the seforim, but I'll mention it. If there's something that's falling apart, sometimes in chicken soup, you have a piece of zucchini or a potato that's kind of falling. You start touching it and it's falling apart. There's no tochen there. It's memela tachun already. It's falling apart. So the Shmir Shabbos says if you have something that's not falling apart, it's not cooked, then asal raskam. You're not allowed to crush it. You can cut it into bigger pieces, bigger than usual. Not to cut it finely. And try to do it next to the suda also. Or Mordechai Eliyahu, again, if you don't hold like this Rashba, you don't say that miyad is mutter, and we assume, like the Shulchan Aruch, that cutting is tochein, then the only other answer is to cut it in larger sizes than you normally cut it. If you look in the Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, in Source 28, he's talking about making an Israeli salad on Shabbos. He says, cut it slightly larger than usual. Sheila, in mutar lachtoch yerakos l'salad b'Shabbos, tshuva, mutar lachtoch salad yerakos b'Shabbos, ubitnai sheyishane mehagodel harogil. But you should change from the normal size, lachtoch b'derech klal. Kigon, adam shechotech agvaniya b'yom chol. If normally you cut a tomato, lachatichos begodosh centimeters, shekolachas, each one is a centimeter. On Shabbos, do 1.5 centimeters. Just do it a little bigger. Than one usually does, and do it miyad. So then you're covered. You have the heter of the Rashba, and you're doing it a little bigger than usual. Rabbi Shalom Rosner writes in Shmir Shabbos that if you need to chew it, so then that's big enough. It doesn't just slide down. That's his shear, right? Any piece you need your front teeth to chew on, that would work. Again, Rav Ovadia says in Livia Schen, in source 39, that when somebody is slicing vegetables, so then again, slicing is a machlokes, and miyad is a machlokes. So put it together, and it would be allowed. So again, to summarize, it's a nice chart here on page 86 of summary. The Rashba says it's mutter miyad. The Ramah Paschals like that Rashba. The Aruch HaShulchan defends that Rashba because after all, but when you eat. And, this is not called a Melacha. And Rav Ovadia's Meikar didn't like that. But the other, the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch does not quote it. The Magen Avraham argues on this Rashba and the Ramah. Yes, maybe people do it and they rely on it, but it's really definitely better not to. Okay, but that is the next limitation, right? Maybe Ein Tochen Ela Lahaniach, we said. So Ein Tochen Ela, where it's lavashel, or where it's going to make it edible, or if it's only Lahaniach and not for miyad purposes. 2 or 3 more limitations of Tochen. Again, all of these are post-Gemara. Next, Ein Tochen Ela B'gidulei Karka. Does Tochen apply to non-growing from the ground items? Again, we saw it applies to wood. So wood is from the ground. It's not food. It's not going to be limited to food. This is the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat. The Tzurba Hilchot says it only applies to items that grow from the ground. And one caveat, as we'll see. Says the Tzurba Hilchot. Remember, the Tzurba Hilchot was, we assumed that it was questions that he wrote. He wrote a sefer in question and answer form. Why did he name it Tzurba Hilchot? Because there are 354 questions that he deals with. Deshen is Gematria 354. This is the Truma of the Deshen. Okay. If somebody's teeth aren't working so well, they're elderly and he can't chew, and you have a piece of meat that's a little tough, could go and slishu kashalilos, or it's barbecued. Can I chop up the meat for the person who can't chew? Says the Tzurba Hilchot. Yes, you can. You could chop up the meat because meat is not gidulei karka. Yira destroy b'ki agavna. V'ikal ameimar debabasar mevushalot sli debeni dodidon. If you have cooked meat, kul yamamod deshari, it's all mutter. V'lodami le'eitzim upeiros v'lechem. It's not doma to those. Deinu kule gidulim in haaretz. Those grow from the ground, right? Tvua, kidneys, it has to grow from the ground. Aval basar den gidulim in haaretz. There's no Tochain when it comes to something that doesn't grow from the ground. Wow, that's a big limitation. So we know the Gemara says it by Disha, and some say it by Ma'amer, Karka, but here the Tzurba Hilchot says it by Tochain as well. He does add on towards the end that if you have something, even if it doesn't grow from the grounds, but the Tochain makes it edible, that might also be included. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Shulchan Aruch 31. Mutar lachto basar mavusha. You could cut meat into very fine, tiny pieces. Dak dak. Avalazar lachto dak dak basar chai. But not raw meat that you give into the birds. Because there, again, it doesn't come up so much this part of the halacha, because that's going to be edible by cutting it up, and therefore you're making it into an ochel. Okay, but either way, the rule of indisha, ein tochen abudu karka is huge. But there is a limit. Even if I'm grinding something that is not gedulei karka, says the Shiur Shabbos, based on earlier sources, you can't use a kli miyucha b'kach. You can't use a grinder. Ochlin, some say, like based on the Rashba, if you can use that miyad, so you also have to have the limitation of a kli, like kli bora, kli tochen. Okay, but the Shiur Shabbos says ochlin she'inam gedulei karka. Not with a special grinder. Why is that? That's not a Tochen issue. That's a uvdin dechol issue. I'm not supposed to do acts that are normally associated with weekday activities. I'm not supposed to do that on Shabbos. I can mash. We'll get to mashing. I can cut with the points of a teeth of a fork. An egg, a meat, or fish, because those do not grow from the ground. Also, Rav Avadia in the Yalkut Yosef, mitam zeh mutar lachto gvina b'sakin dak dak, cheese, eggs, fish, chicken, meat. All of those are not subject to Tochain. But kli miyuchad is not allowed. Kli miyuchad is not allowed, as the Shulchan Aruch Rav explains, based on the Shulchan Aruch, a garlic press, a pepper grinder, any of these would be a kli miyuchad. Maybe a potato masher also, right? A kli miyuchad for Tochain, that would not be allowed. What about an egg slicer? Spoke about it here, Machlokas, page 89. So an egg slicer is always used for something that is not subject to Tochain. So how can you say that's uftin dechol? Right? It's never used on a weekday for a Melacha. So that's why if you have a picture of it there, an egg slicer, so maybe that's why an egg slicer would be mutter. That's not a kli Tochain. Or won't relate to anything that's usher. And therefore, the Yalkut Yosef is matir, and Rav Shalom Rosner is also matir. He thinks that an egg slicer anyway is just a bunch of knives. Right, it's not a Tochain instrument. It's just a bunch of knives, and therefore it would be allowed. Okay, but this is another limitation of ein Tochain ela b'gedulei karka. I think we have two more. What about maybe three more? What about mashing? So we spoke about pulverizing, crushing wheat into powder. That's the Melacha. What about cutting? That's what we spoke about. Machlokas, Rabbi Hananel, Rabbi Mirashi. What about cutting and leaving long thin? Machlokas, Rabbi Yashav and Rabbi Moshe. What about mashing? So mashing is a little different. It's not regular Tochen, because Tochen is I start out with one unit and I end up with a lot of different pieces. Mashing, I end up with one unit too. It's all connected. It's just in a different form than it was. So what about mashing or pureeing? What is the halacha? So the Chazon Ish assumes l'chumra. The Chazon Ish says this is Tochain, and it's even more chomer than other Tochains. Because even if you want to say the Rashba / Ramaz Heter by other cases of Tochain, you don't have it by mashing.
Ariella?
Mashing is even more chomer. Says the Chazon Ish, Amnam, kishachotcha lachlo miyad, baseh. Das HaRashba, remember the Rashba says mutter. V'yesh l'tamu al zeh. The Tosefta, the Chazon Ish garners a Tosefta which says, Ein maraskin devela v'go v'chur l'fnei zakenim. You're not allowed to crush up dates or figs or carobs in front of zakenim, elders. Says the Chazon Ish, that sounds like it's miyad. In front of doesn't mean for them for later, it means right now. And the Tosefta says it's still usher. Why is it usher? Rashba, why is it usher? Miyad is mutter. Says the Chazon Ish, it must be that crushing in this way, mashing, is even more chamor. And even if you say other tochen is mutter miyad, not this one. Cutting is not the classic tochen. When you cut something, you're cutting it to put it into your mouth. When you're mashing, says the Chazon Ish, you're creating a new substance. Is that dafka what you do before you put it into your mouth? You mash it. You don't have to mash it. You can bite it. But says the Avorisuk, Dahainu, Ketisha, Kemaisa Tchina Mamish, says the Chazon Ish, mashing cannot be looked at as an extension of your eating. It's more chamor, and therefore even if you say miyad works by cutting, it does not work by mashing, according to the Chazon Ish. And the Shmir Shabbos also, right, says, right, what about mashing a banana? What about mashing an avocado, right, Tochain? So the Shmir Shabbos also, Peros Chaim, going banana or avocado, Ein l'marchel aprusas lechem. You can't mash it and spread it in the normal way. Mishum esutchina, elam kenim rachem od, unless they're very soft. Shekshaochso b'mixas hapri ein ashar nigra acharav. You pick a piece up and the whole thing falls apart. So that is the das l'chumra. The das l'chumra of the Chazon Ish. But Reb Moshe says many achronim reject the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish is a das yachid. Mashing, especially for miyad, is mutter. If this is Tochain, the Rashba says Tochen miyad is mutter. Right, Tochen is mutter. The Chazon Ish said L'fnei Zakenim means miyad. They're sitting there. Who says that? Rav Moshe says. Maraska L'fnei Zakenim means you're doing it for the Zakenim. Who says that they're mamish there? Who says that's miyad? How can you say this? The Rashba doesn't sound like. You look at the Rashba's lashon. He says misvara Tochain is right before you eat it. So therefore it's mutter miyad. The Chazon Ish says, mashing is not. It's a big chiddush, says Rav Moshe. Tshuva, says Rav Moshe. Hine pashtus lashon Ramam on page 93. B'mechatek rogas v'charuvin. Shows her atosefta. Hu dafka b'chodech u'meiniach. Aval lo miyad akol shari. It's mutter. Shalafnei zakenim v'shatanya sha'asu l'aniach la'achar zman. The Chazon Ish, says Rav Moshe, is a das yachid. V'gam neged aminag ve'ein lasar. You could do avocado, you could do banana. In the normal way, according to Rav Moshe, according to Rav Ovadia, also mashing l'tzorach miyad is mutter. If you want to be yotzi the Chazon Ish, so do it with the Shinuy, as we'll get to soon. Do it with the Shinuy for the Chazon Ish. So again, that's the next potential limitation of the Melacha, and that is maybe it doesn't apply to mashing. Maybe it doesn't apply to mashing. Next, we just mentioned the concept of Shinuy, so let's continue and talk about that a little more. Usually we mention in our Shiurim about the Yesodos of Hilchot Shabbos, Melacha Shabbos, Shinuy usually takes something down from a Daraisa to a Darabanan. Daraisa to a Darabanan. If I do it in an unusual way, it can't be Melechas B'Chsheves, so it's a Darabanan. Once in a while, there are Shinuyim that if you do the Melacha B'Shinuy, it's mutter. Right? Sometimes you have exceptions to the rule. Remember, we just have borer. There's no psik ratio by borer. So here, maybe there's no isur d'Rabbanan by Tochain by certain shinuyim. Right? The Gemara says in Shabbos Kuf Mem Aleph, source 46. Amar of Yehuda, hai pilpule, those pepper, medak chada chada bakata sakina, you could crush one by one with the handle of a knife. Shari, tarti aser, but not two. Rava Amar, kiva de mishani afilu tu banami. Rava, once you're doing it in an unusual way, once you're crushing it with the handle of a knife, it's mutter. You can do as much as you want. As much as you want. So the question is, why? This is a Melacha. And if it's not Daraisa, it should be D'Rabbanan with a Shinuy. Explains the Shibbolei Halachot, one of the great Rishonim of Sivkiyah Rofei, there are two types of Shinuy. We might call it a Shinuy Katan and a Shinuy Gadol. Right? A minor Shinuy and a major Shinuy. Says the Shibbolei Halachot, if you do a major Shinuy, which changes the whole Tzuras HaMalacha, so then it could be even mutter. If you do a minor Shinuy, you're doing the Melacha in an unusual way, that's going to be D'Rabbanan. But if you do such a major Shinuy, then you're not even doing the Melacha at all. That's what the Shibbolei Halachot says. Kata de Zakina, the handle of a knife, Shinuy Gomerhu. That's a total Shinuy. You usually use a pestle and a mortar. The back of a knife, total Shinuy, you're not even doing the Melacha at all. Very important comment of the Shiur Leket, and the Beis Yosef quotes it. Beis Yosef quotes this, source 48, Shori Lamet Apel B'Vekat Sakina, but the Beis Yosef points out that for the Rambam, you have to do a double Shinuy. Use the back of a knife and into a bowl, not into the bottom of the grinder bowl that you usually do. The Shulchan Aruch seems to say you need both Shinuyim. The Shulchan Aruch quotes that from the Rambam in Shin Chaf Aleph Zayin, in source number 49. Mutter laduch pilpulin afilu harbe yachad v'husha yaducham bekata shel sakina ubika'ara. A double change ensures that it does not look like the tzura of the Melacha, right? Otherwise, it would be uvd in the chol. Or even Tochen. So says the. So what do you do with the crushing the tosefta? So you have to say maybe that's not miyad, right? If it was miyad, it would be okay, right? Miyad would be okay. Again, Ramosha says in source 52, you want to be yotze the Chazon Ish, so do it with a Shinuy. Double. So the Chazon Ish doesn't hold of the, he thinks mashing is more chamur. So Ramosha says you can do it with a Shinuy from Miyad. So you have the Shinuy that's based on this Gemara, and you have the Miyad based on the Rashba. So you have a couple of legs to stand on in this case. What exactly is considered a Shinuy? So again, is a fork usually a grinding instrument? What about a fork? A fork. So that's not so clear. The Aruch HaShabbos assumes it's usher, and probably that's a good idea because we usually mash things with a fork. How do you mash an avocado? Most things are mashed with a fork. So use the back of a fork. Use a spoon. Just use something that is unusual, and then one could find a tzad lahakel. So again, bananas, avocado, 3 tzadim. If you want to do it with a Shinuy, great. But 3 tzadim not. Maybe there's no problem by mashing at all, or a Moshe. Maybe there's no Tochen by mashing. It's not the tzur of the Melacha. Maybe you do it miyad, the Rashba, which the Ramah quotes. If you do it miyad, it's mutter, and most of the time that's when you're preparing this food. Or you do it with a Shinuy, that also a total Shinuy. So then it would matir the case as well. One final heter. What did we say so far? We've had limitations. Maybe we have the Melacha of Tochein, but maybe Tochen only applies to where it's not edible beforehand. Maybe it only applies where you're going to cook it. Maybe it doesn't apply to cutting. Maybe it applies to cutting, but not where you're going to leave the long, narrow strips. Maybe it doesn't apply miyad. Maybe it only applies to kidulei karka. Again, as we discussed, some of these are more accepted and some of them not. Maybe it doesn't apply to mashing. Maybe it doesn't apply if you do a b'shinui. Last one. It doesn't apply when it's already been ground up. Tochain, Achar, Tochen. We discussed ein bishul, Achar, bishul, but now we have ein Tochen, Achar, Tochen. Says the Ran. Again, all of these are not in the Gemara. These are all from the Rishonim. The Ran, source 55, first source here on page 99. Hitir lefare petite lechem l'tarnagolim. You're allowed to crush up little pieces of bread for chickens. L'aseiz l'im l'alter. Why? Why could you crush up bread? L'fi shein tchina achar tchina. Once something is ground up, originally you had wheat and you ground it up to flour and then you baked it into bread, so this was ground up already. Ein Tochain, Achar Tochen, and that's the Ramah quotes that. The Ramah quotes the Heter Miyad, and the Ramah quotes this, but this one is not argued upon. This one is not argued upon. The question, though, that's dealt with is that there seems to be a Shulchan Aruch that might be against this. We don't want to say that. Because the Shulchan Aruch, nobody says beferish that there is Tochen Achar Tochen, but the Shulchan Aruch says if you have dried mud on your shoe, source 57, be careful when you rub it and scrape it off. Because if it comes off as a powder, that's Tochen. That's Tochen. And the question is dirt. Dirt was already crushed up, and then it got back together when it got moist, and it got crushed up. So wouldn't you say ein Tochen Achar Tochen when it comes to dirt? So says the Chazon Ish, ein Tochen Achar Tochen is not like ein bishul achar bishul. Ein bishul achar bishul means once the ma'isa bishul was done on this item, it's not subject to bishul again. We discussed bishul achar afiyah, but ein bishul achar bishul, that's the act. Ein Tochen Achar Tochen is different. Says the Aruch HaShabbos explaining the Chazon Ish. No, what it means is Tochen only applies when it comes from a natural unit of an item that Hashem made. A chibur tiv'i. You crush up a fruit or a vegetable. But if you're crushing up something that was humanly created, then halacha doesn't even look at that as a unit. You're going to crush up what? Crush up something that I made, but my putting it together, chibure adam eino chibur. And therefore it's not called crushing it up. Says the Orcha Shabbos, again explaining the Chazon Ish. Demitoch shakemach hayimefurar rakadei ma'isa ha'adam shelosh oso va'afa nischaber. I put the flour together into the bread. Ein lechibur zeh shem chibur lini melachas Tochain. Regarding Tochen, this is not connected. Maybe regarding Chastum V'Tara it is, but regarding Tochen it's not. Varizeh adayin ki mefur is looked at as separate little particles, and therefore there's no Melacha of Tochain. The only time you might say differently is if there's no recognizable status of the previous Tochen. If it's totally removed, so there are cases like that. Some say chocolate. How is chocolate made? Let's say you want to crush up chocolate, powder of chocolate to put onto the top of a cake. So maybe some say if you had chocolate beans, they were already crushed up at the chocolate powder. They made the chocolate, so now there should be a Tochen Achar Tochen. Unless you say that the original Tochen was butla totally because it's not recognizable. Either way, the principle of Tochen Achar Tochen applies, and most of the time it's cakes and matzah. No problem with sprinkling that into your soup in the Kli Shlishi, as we discussed, because there's no problem with Tochen Achar Tochen. So this takes us through Tochain. So we did Bori, we did Tochain. The next one on the horizon is the Melacha of Lush.